Night Court ran on NBC from 1984 to 1992, and for those 8 years, a late-night Manhattan courtroom became one of the decade's stranger comfort zones, a place where the chaos was real enough to sting and absurd enough to survive, and where the people moving through it were, somehow, reliably worth watching. That was more than 30 years ago. The credits have stopped rolling for most of them now. 6 of the 9 people in this story are gone. 3 are still here. When Night Court first aired, Harry Anderson was 31 years old. In 2026, he would have been 73. Hold that arithmetic for a moment. It says something about where all of us are standing. One person in this cast spent 9 seasons winning television's most prestigious honors, playing a character he had almost nothing in common with. And what existed on the other side of that gap, in the life he was actually living the whole time, is the most unexpected story in this group. That story comes near the end. Get settled. Some of this is going to land harder than you remember the show. Number 1, we have Richard Moll as Bull Shannon, the show's most visible impossibility. 6 feet and 8 inches of human being who moved through the chaos of that courtroom with the deliberate gentleness of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that size was not the same thing as force. Moll was 41 when Night Court began filming. He remained for every one of its 193 episodes across all 9 seasons, a commitment that most supporting actors never make, and that this particular show rewarded with a kind of institutional warmth. When he shaved his head for the role, it was an act of total commitment from a man who had been waiting a long time for the right room to walk into, what most viewers never registered. Before Night Court, Richard Moll had spent much of the 1970s being turned away from casting calls precisely because nobody had a template for someone who looked the way he did. Bull Shannon was the first character written for him rather than forced around him. That fit shows in every scene, once you know to look for it. After Night Court ended in 1992, he built a durable secondary career in horror films and B-movies, but found his most consistent late work in voiceover, where his deep, distinctive bass became a genuine asset, completely detached from the intimidation of his height. He spent years lending that voice to animated series and video games, working steadily and outside the frame of most Night Court conversations. He was married to Jennifer Cates, with whom he had twin daughters. That marriage eventually ended. In later years, he lived near Big Bear, California, in the San Bernardino Mountains, a retreat from the industry that, viewed from a distance, resembled peace. Richard Moll died on October 26, 2023. He was 80 years old. Natural causes, at home in Big Bear. He had outlived 4 of the people who shared that courtroom with him, which is itself a quiet kind of achievement in a cast where the losses came early and kept coming. Bull Shannon looked like someone the room should fear. Richard Moll turned out to be someone who spent 30 years making children laugh in cartoon voices. And that gap, once you know it, changes everything about what you were watching. 2 is Markie Post as Christine Sullivan, the public defender who held Night Court's moral center. The woman whose refusal to treat the courtroom's absurdity as sufficient reason to abandon principle was itself, across 7 seasons, the most reliable running joke the show had. Markie Post died on August 7, 2021. She was 70 years old. She had been living with cancer for nearly 4 years, diagnosed in early 2017, continuing to work through chemotherapy with the same composed steadiness her character demonstrated weekly. She appeared in The Kids Are All Right and Santa Clarita Diet while in treatment, making her illness a side project rather than a story. The specific cancer type was never publicly disclosed. She died at home in Los Angeles. She was 34 when she joined Night Court's 2nd season in 1985, arriving directly from 3 years playing a bail bondswoman on ABC's The Fall Guy. Before either of those roles, she had spent years working as an associate producer on game shows, Double Dare, Card Sharks, building a structural understanding of performance before she was ever asked to deliver one. That foundation sits inside every Christine Sullivan scene. The precision of the timing, the sense of a mind that always knows exactly where the argument is going. After Night Court ended in 1992, she moved directly into Hearts of Fire, alongside John Ritter, a 3-season CBS sitcom that gave her a second television home without matching the cultural presence of the first. She continued working steadily through the 2000s and 2010s in recurring guest roles, never disappearing entirely, never requiring anyone to notice. She was married to television writer-producer Michael A. Ross for decades, and they had two daughters. After her death, her family described her as someone who made elaborate cakes for friends, sewed curtains for first apartments, and showed us how to be kind, loving, and forgiving in an often harsh world. That is not a eulogy. That is a character reference, and it is exactly right. The cameras moved on. Markie Post moved differently. Toward her daughters, toward the work she could still do, toward nearly 4 years of fighting that nobody filmed, and built a privacy in the space where the spotlight used to be. 3. And someone the Night Court record tends to undercount. Ellen Foley, who played public defender Billy Young across the show's first 2 seasons. The character who carried the show's idealism before the production found the particular, stranger version of warmth it became known for. In 2026, Ellen Foley is 74 years old and still performing. She has sustained an active career in music and theater for 5 decades, moving between recording, touring, and stage work in a pattern that has almost nothing to do with the television run her Night Court viewers can name. She departed after the 2nd season, replaced by Markie Post in a casting restructuring the production handled quietly. The departure did not define her. She was 32 when Night Court's first season filmed. What almost no viewer watching that 1984 courtroom knew was that Foley had already appeared on one of the most commercially successful rock albums ever recorded. In 1977, she sang the female vocal parts on Meat Loaf's Bat Out of Hell, the uncredited voice in Paradise by the Dashboard Light, part of an album that eventually sold more than 40 million copies worldwide. She had released her own solo recordings in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and the music was always the central through line of her working life, running parallel to and underneath whatever was happening on screen. Her stage career has been substantial and consistent, with extensive work across British and American theater over several decades. She has spoken openly about choosing not to have children, describing that decision with clarity rather than apology. The thing most Night Court viewers carry without knowing it. Billy Young's portrayer was already more recognizable on vinyl, to far more people, than the show would ever make her on a television screen. Decades after Night Court, Ellen Foley still records and performs, which means Billy Young never quite stopped existing, just changed address. 4 is Selma Diamond as Selma Hacker, Night Court's first bailiff. A small woman with a chain smoker's rasp and the bluntness of someone who had been the funniest person in every room for 40 years and was no longer interested in pretending it surprised her. She was 63 years old when Night Court began filming. That number matters as context for everything that follows, because Diamond was not a late-discovered character actress who happened to fit the part. She was one of the most respected comedy writers in American television history, and she was on that screen only because she had already done everything else. The hidden truth behind that bailiff's desk is this. In the early 1950s, Selma Diamond was one of the staff writers for Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca's Your Show of Shows, the writer's room that also employed Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and is generally credited with establishing the grammar of American television comedy. She earned an Emmy nomination for her subsequent work on Caesar's Hour. Her personality as head writer was said to be the direct inspiration for the Sally Rogers character on The Dick Van Dyke Show. She had published cartoons in The New Yorker. She had written for Groucho Marx's radio program. None of this appeared in the Night Court credits. What viewers understood as Selma Hacker's natural authority was the residue of 30 years spent building rooms where authority was defined. Diamond never married. She described her work as the primary organizing fact of her life, and the record bears that out completely. Selma Diamond died on May 13, 1985, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. She was 64 years old. The cause was lung cancer. She had been a chain smoker for decades, as her character was on screen. And she died while the 3rd season of Night Court was in production. Selma Hacker carried that sardonic authority for 2 seasons and made it look like personality. Selma Diamond carried 6 decades of comedy in an industry that rarely kept women funny for that long. And that weight, unlike the show, never got a resolution. 5 is Florence Halop, who stepped into the bailiff's role after Selma Diamond's death. The woman who took the impossible assignment of replacing someone irreplaceable and did it with enough wit and enough warmth that the show could survive the loss and keep going. Florence Halop died on July 15, 1986. She was 63 years old. Following a stroke in June of that year, she was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer. She had been a heavy smoker her entire adult life, as Diamond had been. Night Court lost two consecutive bailiff actresses to the same disease within 13 months of each other. The production did not make a public event of the coincidence. It is one of the stranger, sadder facts in the show's history, and it tends to disappear from the record. She was 62 years old when Night Court found her, an age at which most of the industry considers the conversation finished. What Night Court's viewers almost never knew was that Florence Halop had been working continuously in American entertainment since she was 4 years old. A 1931 newspaper item described her as NBC's youngest star. She had appeared in radio productions by Orson Welles' Mercury Theater. She was one of the definitive performers of radio's Duffy's Tavern. She had held a regular role on early television's Meet Millie in the 1950s. Her brother was Billy Halop, one of the original Dead End Kids. By the time she arrived on Night Court's set, she had been doing this for more than 50 years. She was married to talent agent George Gruskin, who died in 1976. They had 2 daughters. The decade between his death and her role on Night Court was spent entirely working. 6 is Marsha Warfield, who replaced both of her predecessors and became, for the final 6 seasons of Night Court's run, something they were never asked to be: a character with genuine menace beneath the comedy. Roz Russell was the show's unmovable object, a woman who had seen everything that courtroom could produce and been impressed by none of it. In 2026, Marsha Warfield is 72 years old. She is performing stand-up comedy, holding a recurring role in 911, and has returned to Night Court's orbit via the NBC Revival series, where the writers gave Roz something her original creators never considered. She appears to be, by most measures, in a very good place. She was 32 when she joined the show in 1986. Before that, she had been a writer and performer on The Richard Pryor Show and had won the San Francisco International Comedy Competition in 1979, a competition in which she beat, among others, a young Dana Carvey. She arrived at Night Court already a trained professional with years of stage experience, not a find. After Night Court ended in 1992, she had recurring roles on Empty Nest and hosted the Marsha Warfield Show for 10 months before stepping away from Hollywood for nearly 2 decades. She has kept her reasons private, saying only that family matters needed her full attention and that the retreat was, in her own word, a return to sanity. She came back to stand-up in 2015 and describes her career as having genuinely resumed only in 2017. What most viewers of the original show never knew: for all of those years, from the Night Court set through the long years away, Marsha Warfield was carrying a truth she had not yet named publicly. She came out as gay in 2017 at 63. Her mother had known all along and had asked her to wait until after she died. Warfield kept that promise. "I agreed," she has said, "even though the request and her admission were hurtful in ways I couldn't put my finger on then, and probably haven't completely worked through now." She has since married her partner. Roz Russell ended when the final credits rolled in 1992. Marsha Warfield kept going, through the years away, through standing up again, through naming herself at 63. And that continuation is the truer, harder, more worthwhile story. 7 is Charlie Robinson, who played court clerk Macintosh Robinson from Night Court's 2nd season through its final episode. The person who kept the whole apparatus from collapsing. Mac's steadiness was so consistent that the show depended on it without always bothering to acknowledge it. At the height of Night Court's run, Robinson appeared in every episode from Season 2 onward, over 180 in total, and directed 3 of them himself. The NAACP Image Award he received for the role reflected recognition that rarely followed him into the wider entertainment conversation. The dimension Robinson had been building in parallel, and that most Night Court viewers had no access to, was the stage. He was a member of the Actors Studio. He won an Ovation Award for his portrayal of Troy Maxon in August Wilson's Fences. He played Willie Loman in a production of Death of a Salesman. Playwright Lyle Kessler described him, after working with him, as one of the great American actors. As late as 2020 during the pandemic, he quarantined with a friend to write and perform a new play together. He was still building something. Before acting, in his Houston teens, He had been a singer with Archie Bell and the Drells. His life in the industry spanned 5 decades and existed in registers that television credits alone could not capture. His personal life centered on his family. He is survived by his wife Dolorita, 4 sons, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His wife described him, after his death, as the love of her life, and said the wind beneath his wings was his family. Charlie Robinson died on July 11, 2021, at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 75 years old. The cause was cardiac arrest with multisystem organ failure, resulting from septic shock and metastatic adenocarcinoma. He died 27 days before his Night Court co-star Markie post. Mac Robinson never needed to be more than the steadiest person in the room. It turns out Charlie Robinson never needed to be more either, and there is more grace in that than most people give it credit for. 8. And the story promised at the opening. John Larroquette, as Dan Fielding, the assistant district attorney whose spectacular moral flexibility was, for 9 seasons, the most reliable engine of the show's comedy. Dan Fielding was the character the courtroom could not contain. Ambitious, venal, absurd, and occasionally, in spite of everything, almost decent. Larroquette was 36 when Night Court began. The role won him 4 consecutive Emmy Awards for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Comedy Series, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988. A record at the time. After his 4th win, he asked the Television Academy to remove his name from consideration entirely so other actors could have a chance. No one in the category's history had made that choice before. Here is the hidden truth. John Larroquette had been sober since February 5, 1982. He had quit drinking after what he described as an out-of-body experience while in the company of a fellow addict. 2 full years before Night Court's first episode aired. Every Dan Fielding scene, every Emmy acceptance speech for a character built entirely on excess, all of it filmed by a man who had already confronted the version of himself that could have become that character and decided against it. He never hid his sobriety, very few people thought to ask. After Night Court, he created The John Larroquette Show, a darker, single-camera comedy about a recovering alcoholic rebuilding his life at the night desk of a bus station, which won a Peabody Award in its first season despite finding almost no primetime audience. He won a 5th Emmy in 1998 for a guest role in The Practice, playing a psychopathic murderer of almost operatic menace. In 2011, he made his Broadway debut in the revival of How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, alongside Daniel Radcliffe, winning the Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. In 2023, he returned to NBC as Dan Fielding in the Night Court revival, the only principal cast member from the original still alive to do so, with his son Benjamin having composed the new show's theme music. He has been married to Elizabeth Ann Cookson since 1975. They have 3 children. In 2026, he is 78 years old and still working. Dan Fielding gave John Larroquette everything the industry offers: the recognition, the audience, 4 Emmys in a row. John Larroquette gave something back that nobody planned for: 44 years of sobriety, a Broadway Tony, a 5th Emmy on the other side of everything, and proof that the most interesting story a person can live is frequently the one they chose to keep private. 9. And last, Harry Anderson as Judge Harry T. Stone, the magician in a black robe who ran his courtroom the way a good conjurer runs a stage, by making everyone feel simultaneously that nothing was under control and that everything was going to be fine. Harry Anderson died on April 16, 2018. He was 65 years old. The cause was a stroke, technically a cardioembolic cerebrovascular accident, with influenza and heart disease as contributing factors. He was found at home in Asheville, North Carolina, by police officers who responded that morning. He was alone when they arrived. He was 31 when Night Court began, and he had arrived at the role from a direction his producers never quite stopped being surprised by. Anderson had spent his 20s as a street performer, literally running a shell game and working sleight of hand on the streets of San Francisco, Chicago, and New Orleans. He was not an actor who did magic. He was a magician who discovered by accident that television wanted him. "I guess they figured I was an actor," he said years later. "I never auditioned for anything. They named the character Harry so I'd remember to react when someone said my name. By the time they figured out that I couldn't act scared on the subway at 4 a.m., I already had a 5-year contract. After Night Court ended in 1992, he followed it with Dave's World, a CBS sitcom based on the life of humorist Dave Barry, which ran 4 seasons and gave him a second television success that the industry rarely offers. He then did something the industry offers even more rarely. He walked away from it. He and his second wife Elizabeth moved to New Orleans in 2002, where he opened a nightclub in the French Quarter called Oswald's Speakeasy, where he performed. Hurricane Katrina destroyed that life in 2005. He and Elizabeth moved to Asheville in 2006, and they stayed. He was married twice. His first marriage to Leslie Pollock produced 2 children, Eva and Dashiell, and ended in 1999. He married Elizabeth Morgan in 2000. The Asheville years were quieter, more private, and then, at 65, they were over. What most viewers never fully absorbed was that Harry Anderson had never tried to be an actor. He was a magician who happened to be very good at making you believe you were watching something else entirely. That is not a performance technique. That is a philosophy. And it was the same philosophy running through every scene he ever filmed. The same one he had been working since he was a teenager on the streets of San Francisco. Reading a room, finding the angle, making the mark feel like a guest. Judge Harry T. Stone was the trick the audience never tired of watching. Harry Anderson was the magician who had been running it since he was 17 years old. And if the final disappearance, in a quiet house in North Carolina in the spring of 2018, arrived harder than any of his others, it is only because after all those years we still had not figured out which hand to watch.